talking about the Horizons long-term plan. Just give us a little intro.
Kia ora, I'm Anthonie Tonnon. I represent Wanganui District Councillors on public transport matters over at Horizons Regional Council. Right now, it's our Horizons long-term plan consultation. So that's our plan for the next 10 years. And in that plan, we have some big items for public transport. We have, for Wanganui, we have the opportunity of a new Wanganui bus network, and we have the opportunity of new regional routes in Wanganui. So as part of this plan, we have a few questions on public transport. So if I look in here, questions 6, 7 and 8 are all on public transport. One on Wanganui City, one on regional services for the whole region, which includes Wanganui, and one for the Hora Whenua. Our preferred option at Horizons is option 1 for all questions. And option 1 will see big improvements to all of those things. So the first question is on Wanganui improvements, and really what this means is a new network for Wanganui. There are two types of public transport you can run in cities. There's something called the ridership approach. So the ridership approach is when you design your bus network to try to get as many users as possible. It's a very simple goal. And to do that, we use direct, frequent routes. And we run service for long hours of the day. So if you look at our network in 1948, where you see the red lines, the buses went every 15 minutes. Where you see blue lines, they went every 30 minutes, and green lines every hour. And this service ran from before 7 in the morning until 11 p.m. And 6 days a week, and it still ran on Sundays as well. So, and with this network in the middle of the century, we took 3 million boardings on our trams and then later buses in Wanganui. And it should be said that even though of course we had a really great trams system, even when the trams went, we still had lots of use on our bus system. It was called the Greyhound Bus Network. I have this great newspaper from the day it was launched when Greyhound started, and they were really well used. They were doing between 1.5 and 2 million boardings a year in the 50s. But even by the 80s, they were still doing 600,000 trips a year. Now, the other approach to public transport is what's called coverage. So since the 2000s, we've only had coverage service in Wanganui. So this is our network just before the tide started in 2022. So it looks like there is lots of service, but what you notice here is that most of the lines are purple. And if they're purple, it means the bus only goes every 2 hours. And a bus is like a magic road that disappears if there is not a bus coming pretty soon. And so for most people, if you're on a 2-hourly service route, the bus kind of doesn't exist for you. So for the last year, we've been trying an experiment with moving away from this coverage approach to moving to the ridership approach. And we've done that with the Tide service. So the Tide runs every 20 minutes. Now, in the year that we've run this, so if you look at January last year, that was the last month that we didn't have Tide service. So last January, we had 5,700 people use all of our buses in Wanganui. This January, we had 12,000 trips on our buses, and 8,000 of them were on the Tide. So in that 1 year, we've more than doubled the amount of people using the buses, and more than 60% of those people are on the Tide buses. The other 40% are on our 8 2-hourly coverage routes. So what we're proposing to do is to introduce a simpler system where we might have 3 Tide-like routes for the city, so that everyone will have access, or most people will have access to that 20-minute service. We still might have some hourly routes that connect into that.
Okay, so what would you say to people who are worried about a whole bunch of empty tired buses driving around Wanganui?
Well, the first thing to say is it's not a worry. I mean, people do say to me, oh, I saw 3 people on the bus today. Are you worried? I'm not worried. So a bus is like a footpath. We keep the footpaths open 24 hours a day, and it costs us a lot of money to do that. And sometimes they are completely empty. Sometimes they have a few more people on them, but we wouldn't put up the road cones and close the footpaths just because they might be a bit empty between 3 and 5 o'clock. With public transport, what we're trying to do is create something that's as convenient as a road. And if the road disappeared every half hour, it wouldn't be very convenient. Or if the road turned off at 6 o'clock at night, it wouldn't be very convenient. And we have busy hours and quiet hours on the tide. Our really busy hours, actually, to our surprise, have tended to be between 11 a.m. and 3 p.m. And we do get quiet hours between 6 and 7 at night, for example. But the reason we do later service on buses is because the fact that the bus service is running at 6 p.m. actually means more people will take it at 3 p.m. when it's busy, because they might feel comfortable coming in at 3 p.m. but knowing they have the option to come back at 5, but they also have the option to come back at 6, or the option to come back at 7. So on any successful bus service, we always expect some quiet times. Even you go to Auckland, which has really high bus use, you always see some buses that just have a couple of people on them. Now, it's worth saying, we've doubled our use on buses in the last year, and even on the Tide service, since the Tide service started last March, our use of the Tide service has risen by 65%. Now, I think we will double our bus service again if we can go to a network approach. So even the quieter times will become a little bit less quiet, or there'll become less of them. And that's already happening. I'm already seeing more people on the buses. But we'll always expect some quieter times. The great thing about buses is that when you get a shock, when you get a really busy period, say like Vintage Weekend when we had completely full buses, you can accommodate them. And at no extra cost.
But you don't have to bring on extra drivers for a whole bunch of extra small vans.
Well, this is the thing. So in our busiest hours on the Tide, we move 60 people, and it takes us 4 drivers and buses. Now, with an on-demand system, the most that they can move is 4 to 5 people per driver and vehicle that they have. So to move 60 people in that busy hour, you'd have to bring on 12 drivers. And that's much more expensive than having 4 drivers with a larger bus. The other thing about on-demand services and smaller buses is it means that every time you get a few more passengers, you need more drivers. And so your system gets more and more expensive as it becomes more popular. The amazing thing about a bus with a bit of capacity like we have on the Tide is that we can afford to double, triple, maybe even quadruple our numbers, and it won't cost us any extra to have those extra people. In fact, we'll become cheaper because we'll get the fares from all of those people as well. We now actually have more people per bus on those 20-minute buses than we did have on those 2 hourly buses. So for all the extra service we've put on, we've had at least the same number of people on each bus. So it's a big increase, but the Tide is just one route. So we actually think we can do a lot better. In the last year, we've gone from about 90,000 trips a year to about 180,000 trips. That's what we're tracking for now. But in 1991, the last year that we had the Greyhound bus system, even though they were kind of at the end of their life, their buses were getting old, they took 430,000 trips. And we know that the best thing you can do for bus service is go to a network. That's because the amount of increase you can get on one route is somewhat limited, but if you have 2 routes and you have more destinations you can get to, you start to get network effects. And we see this evidence from other cities that have introduced frequent networks. It's been a big driver of better use of public transport in places like Auckland, but also small places. Queenstown, Waiheke Island, Nelson have all seen really big increases in public transport use, using these all-day frequent services, which go longer hours of the day. And the Nelson network is a really good example. The Nelson network opened last year. They're on track for 800,000 trips this year. We last did that in the 1970s with the Greyhound bus network, and I think we can get there again. It's been a sort of 10-year journey for Nelson since they started investing in a different way, but I think in the mid to long term, that's where we could get back to. So the other big question for Whanganui, and in fact for the whole region, is about new and improved regional services. So what we're proposing to do is actually start a regional network of services. So what it would mean for Whanganui, it's more than just Whanganui because it affects lots of other places, but for Whanganui, we could see 4 services a day that go from Whanganui to Palmerston North, return, and 3 services a day that go to Waikanai Railway Station. That service in particular is really interesting because that would mean that you could get to Wellington in 3 hours. You'd spend the first hour, 40 minutes on a bus, but once you got to Waikanai Station, those trains leave every 20 minutes. So that means that any time of the day, we could choose to send a bus down to Waikanai, and we'd know that there would be a train ready to take people on. So, and then there's also connections there for Palmerston North to get to Waikanai and so on. But over time, this network would be able to get you a real range of places around our region and start to get you around the lower North Island. The other thing is Martin. At the moment, people in Martin can't get to Whanganui unless they take the intercity. And sometimes intercity can be $30, $40 just to get from Martin to Whanganui. So under this scheme, our 4 services a day from Whanganui to Palmerston North would go through Martin. That means people in Martin can go to Whanganui, return as well.
And what times would those services run?
Well, that's something that we need to work out. Certainly it would make sense for us to do something relatively early so that people could get to Wellington. But, at the same time, there's also potential there for counter-peak services, which would mean that maybe you could get to Wellington and leave at 11 or 3 p.m, stay the night and come back the next day, that sort of thing. But what will be possible is to go from Whanganui to Wellington, do a day's work or catch up with people in Wellington for the day and come home the same day. Right now, that's not actually possible in our system. At the moment, it takes 4.5 hours to take a private bus from Whanganui to Wellington because it goes through Palmerston North. Now, the first bus leaves around 8:15. So if you right now, if you take a bus to Wellington, you arrive at 12:30, but the last service that can get you home leaves at 3:30. So you only get 3 hours in Wellington for the price of 8 to 9 hours of travel on a bus. Under this system, 3-hour trip in the morning, 3-hour trip back. But it's not just about that morning and evening peak. And in fact, in public transport, we're moving away from really focusing on the mornings and the evenings. And now we actually focus on service throughout the day because more and more, we don't know when people are going to use public transport, but we know that if we provide it, people can find their own way of using it and find their own way that it's useful. What's great about Whanganui is that we're never going to be part of the commuter belt of Wellington. And I think that's a good thing. It means that we retain a lot of services and a lot of things in our city, a lot of independence. If we were setting the distance out from Wellington that, say, Waikanai or Otaki is, there might be some people that would kind of keep going into Wellington to get their city time and that sort of thing. But what we do in Wanganui is we do business trips to Wellington for a day or two. We go and visit family. We go and see really big events at the Cake Tin or what have you. And having good access to Wellington, I think, for us is crucial. It used to be that you could take a train to Wellington. It used to be, until a few years ago, you could take a flight to Wellington. Essentially, if we can bring back good, frequent, and relatively quick public transport to Wellington, then for the cheapest fare for us, we can get to Wellington, have all the benefits that Wellington can offer, but get home without needing to do that drive every time.
So do any other regions offer public transport between cities similar to what's being proposed here?
Yes, so we're really an outlier in our region. So the Waikato already has a network like this. So between Hamilton and Cambridge, there are 8 public transport services a day return. Between Hamilton and Huntly, it's more like 18. Same in Wellington, and a really good place to see the difference is between Otaki and Waikanae in the Greater Wellington region. Greater Wellington run 18 services a day between Waikanae and Otaki. Now, it's only a little bit further to get to Levin. Horizons right now, we run 2 services per week from Levin to Waikanae. So the difference is quite huge between us and Wellington. It's almost like crossing from East Germany to West Germany in 1989 or something. But even regions that do a little bit less public transport, so Taranaki does less public transport than Waikato and Wellington, but they still have a service between New Plymouth and Hawera, and it runs 4 times a day on weekdays. So that's a smaller population catchment than Wanganui and Palmerston North. So we think it makes great sense for us to get to that 4 times a day number in the near term between Wanganui and Palmerston North.
And so is that New Plymouth to Hawera quite a popular service?
It's one of their most popular services, and it's one of their best performing economically as well. In New Zealand, the best public transport systems tend to have a 50% fare recovery, and that's one service that does have about a 50% recovery of costs from use. So for all public transport questions, I'm backing option 1. Those are options that I've been... The hardest thing with local government is actually getting the question and the consultation in the first place. It's really hard to get plans developed to the point where we get to ask the community, do you want an improvement? So it's been a lot of work by councillors and other people to try to get those questions in there. Really, our proposals are based around option 1. There is an option 2 for the city network. In my view, option 2 is a much lower level of budget. So it probably would see us, option 1 would see us get a new ridership focused network for Wanganui by 2026. Option 2 would see us bring things in much more slowly, probably 2029, 2028, 2029 to see a new network. We'd also probably be focusing on much lower frequencies, so hourly service for a lot of areas. So that's why I'm backing option 1. For our regional services, there's a really big difference again between option 1 and option 2. Option 2 would be a lot less budget. It would be quite similar to what we have at the moment. We have a daily service between Wanganui and Palmerston North. Option 2 would probably see us keep things like daily services, but option 2 would probably also mean we wouldn't see a direct Wanganui to Waikanae Station service anytime soon. So that's why I'm backing option 1, because I think that our own connection with Wellington is actually quite important for our independence. At the moment, Palmerston North has the capital connection, and they have 3 intercity services they can take to get to Wellington. But for Wanganui, it's not actually possible for us to go to Wellington and come back the same day in any kind of practical sense. Option 3 is remain in the current current level of service that we have in Whanganui. Option 2, if option 3 is here, do nothing, and option 1 is here, build a new network. Option 2 is not in the middle, it's really down here, pretty close to do nothing. It's a very incremental improvement. And the big thing for me is that we're starting from a really low base in Whanganui. So the average spend per person on public transport in New Zealand cities is $98 per person. Right now, Whanganui spends $22 per person. So we're starting way down the scale. Now,
Per year, is it?
per year, that's right. So in Wellington, people often say, oh, Wellington has great public transport because there's more people. But actually, they spend much more per person to get that level of service. They spend $170 per person to provide that level of public transport service. Now, in the regions, we do tend to spend less, even in the regions that are doing great public transport. But the new Palmerston North network, which has 7 services with the frequency of the tide, that's costing $68 per person per year. Whanganui is still on $22 per person per year. So I would argue we want to come up a bit and reach our peers. So Nelson and Hamilton both spend around $50 per person per year. So option 1 would get us into that $50 per person per year. And we think that with Wanganui's great geography for public transport, because we were built around a tram system, we can get a great network, cheaper than what Palmerston North is currently paying for their new network.
What's the fare recovery like on the tide?
I think on all Wanganui services, our fare recovery is relatively low. It's between 10 and 20%. That's gone down over recent years because of our costs going up quite a lot. But the other thing is that when you have a coverage system, we expect it to have a low fare box recovery. Coverage systems, they cost you less overall, but they always have a low fare box recovery. Now, we've increased the fare box recovery rate on the tide, and we will continue to, but we're only at the start of our journey with the tide. So, and if we can get to a network approach, we can increase that fare box recovery a lot more.
What do you think about the idea of making public transport free?
One day, I would love to see it one day. I would say that I think it's the last thing we should do, because I think the most important thing to do, and the thing that will make people use public transport the most, is to have the service there in the first place. And so, you know, Luxembourg recently made all public transport free, but that's after a multi-decade journey of making the public transport so good that people are using it. You know, an individual person in Luxembourg might take public transport more than 100 times a year. Whereas, you know, our biggest public transport city, Wellington, takes 70 trips per person per year. So my fear about free fares is that it might freeze our service levels. If the government was to say all public transport is free tomorrow, it would be very, very hard for us to argue to our local councils, hey, give us more service, because they would also know that there would be no more income coming in. We need to be able to offer more service. That's the biggest thing. So right now in Wanganui, we're sort of taking between 2 and 4 trips per person per year. In the past, in the middle of the century, we took more than 70 trips per person per year. Our best way to get people taking more trips is to actually have better service, to have more network, to have more frequency. I don't think politically we could ever get to that level of frequency and quality of service if we made all the services free first. I just think that's a sort of, it's very hard to make that case to councillors. And we kind of need every bit of income that we can, because every time we have more income, we can offer more service, more frequency, and we can bring more people to the network. Absolutely, once we have a lot of people using the network, that's a great time to look at free service.
What if people would rather see rail services than bus services?
Yeah, so absolutely. I mean, lots of us get into public transport because we're excited about the idea of bringing back rail. And, I personally would one day love to see rail reach Wanganui again. The last time that it did was with the Blue Streak rail car in 1977. But what's a little bit underappreciated about the era of rail in Wanganui is that the Blue Streak only went once a day return to Wellington. And it took 4 hours because it went through Fielding and Palmerston North. That's where the railway line goes. And actually, so yes, you could take the Blue Streak once a day in the 70s, but 4 times a day, you could take a Railways road services bus, and that would skip Palmerston North completely, go through Foxton, down to Wellington. So you could actually get to Wellington in closer to 3.5 hours. So there's actually a lot that we have done with the bus before, and there's still a lot that we can do. The problem with rail at the moment is that it has a really long lead time. I'd love to see rail, but I know that, and we are starting to work on this. Got new wording into our regional land transport plan that will make rail services possible if it becomes a little bit easier from the central government or from KiwiRail to do so. But the experience of regions like ours and of the Waikato has been that it takes about 12 to 15 years to get a rail service started, from the time that you start campaigning for it to the time that you see it arrive. And if we have no public transport between cities in the meantime, then people have no way of getting in the habit of using public transport. And when you have somebody that is a little bit skeptical about the cost of rail, they can say, well, there's nobody travelling from Wanganui to Wellington now on public transport, so why should we put on a train that can take 500 people? So I think, rail's always the gateway drug for public transport advocates. We'd all love to see more of it, but it's a very slow process to get there. In the meantime, we can introduce services by road that start a lot sooner and that can take us on a pathway towards rail service in the future.
Okay, so why don't we just use smaller buses?
So this is the big question that public transport advocates get in every Western city in the world. No matter how well your bus system is doing, people are always really surprised at the size of the bus. And they say, why don't we use smaller buses? It seems to make sense. And it's not a silly question, and there are really good answers, and it's worth knowing them because it's the most common question you get. Often you get lots of people who do believe in good, frequent public transport, but they don't understand why the buses are that size. First thing to say is that the Tide buses are smaller. They're 32 seats. The old buses in Wanganui are 40 seats. The trams had 44 seats. They look smaller, but they had way less, health and safety. They didn't have easy accessibility like we expect today. They still needed 44 seats. And sometimes they had up to 100 people on those trams. The big thing to say about bus sizes is the most expensive part is the driver. Generally, the driver costs 75% of the cost of running a bus. So having the size bus that we have is not much more expensive. And it's not much more in emissions either, because our buses are Euro 6 on the Tide. They emit about the same as some SUVs. So we're not getting a big cost from emissions either. Now, the important, in fact, the crucial thing about bus service is you need a bus that is large enough for your busiest service, even if that only happens once a day or once a week. Now, every day on the Tide, you will see a bus service that has more than 12 people on it. If even one of those people has a Zimmer frame or a pram or a wheelchair, we're already too big for a Toyota Hiace or something like that. Or even if we could squeeze them onto that van, we couldn't do it and keep to time. Whereas when you have 12 people on a Tide bus, and one of them has a pram and one of them has a wheelchair, everyone can roll on to the bus with low floorboarding really quickly. Bus can keep moving to time. The other thing is architecture. We actually tried small buses in the 1990s in Wanganui. But here's the thing. A bus is designed to be a space where you're comfortable traveling with strangers. Has 2 seats on either side and an aisle. Now, a Toyota Hiace is a great vehicle, but it's an intimate vehicle. It's designed for traveling with your family, your sports group, your band. You're sitting 3 or 4 deep, thigh to thigh. And what we found in the 1990s is the Toyota Hiaces did 2 things. They left people at the bus stop, which meant they had to wait an hour for the next bus, or they would just give up. And we found that people didn't want to sit thigh to thigh with strangers 3 deep in a Toyota Hiace. So, if you ride the Tide, as I often do, and you have 11 or 10 or 15 people on that bus, you actually feel pretty grateful for that extra space because everyone gets their own seat and it's really easy for people who have a Zimmer frame or wheelchair.
Why don't we run an on-demand system like a public Uber type situation?
Yeah, and this is a really live conversation in public transport at the moment. So Timaru is running an on-demand system, but there are some really good reasons as to why we're not looking at that option. So the purpose of public transport and the thing that gives us the economic and environmental benefits from a bus service is to move lots of people in the same vehicle. That's where you get the efficiencies. An on-demand service is really more like a subsidized taxi service. And as we say, on-demand services can move, they have a really limited capacity. They can move about 4 or 5 people per driver and vehicle they have per hour. At the moment on the Tide, we're moving 60 people per hour in our busy hours, which means we'd have to scale up to 12 drivers rather than the 4 drivers we're currently using. And so it becomes really expensive. When you run a fully on-demand system, every time you get more popular, you either need to bring on more drivers, so your system gets more expensive, or you need to discourage people from using the system in the first place, so doing less marketing or making people wait. So now sometimes on-demand systems, the app will tell you, please expect a 45 minute wait because they don't have enough drivers to actually pick everybody up. The benefits, whereas fixed route bus services can take much larger amounts of people. I guess a really good contrast, there's some interesting experiments going on in New Zealand. So both Timaru and Queenstown have been innovative and tried new things in public transport, and that's great. Timaru and Queenstown both spent a similar amount of money. Timaru went to on-demand, and they've seen, tens of thousands more people use public transport. So that's great. Queenstown spent a similar amount, but they focused on fixed route bus service. They've increased their amount of trips since 2017 by about 1 million a year. So, with a similar amount of cost to Timaru. So you can do so much more with fixed route buses with some capacity. This has actually been tried before. In the 1980s, there was a big movement towards what was called dial a driver. And really on-demand is sort of a modern variation with the cool apps now, but it's really expensive. The subsidy per user on an on-demand system gets between $10 and $15 per trip. The problem is it doesn't drop. So the more popular your system gets, you're always still paying $15 per trip to move them. Whereas with a bus, you might start at $10 a trip when you first introduce a service, but then you can drop and drop and drop. And the subsidy per rider in Queenstown is now down to about $1.50. So your fixed route service gets a lot cheaper over time.
Awesome. Okay, well that's pretty much it, isn't it?
Yeah.
Do you want to show us this little poster in the background? What is this? I'm still rolling.
Oh yeah, so this this is my great map that I bought off the lovely people at Treble. This is a Wisest map of Wanganui. I think it must be from about the late 1940s, at a period where Wanganui had already decided to remove the trams, but they hadn't done it yet. So here in yellow, you can see where our tram routes went. And then in the red dotted lines are the proposals for new bus services. So you can see a couple of things in here. First, we have a much more streamlined tram system at this time. So your route from Aramo just uses the same road all the way down. Trams go down Victoria Ave, and then they do split into two routes here on Alma Road and Tower Street, but then they go back to one simple route down to Castlecliff. The other thing you'll see is that actually if you look at the dotted red lines, they're mostly following where the trams went. So when we brought in buses, the fact that we'd built so many houses along these tram routes was really a big advantage for us. It meant that we could provide really good frequent service relatively cheaply because we'd built so much population around the tram routes. Ironically, because we grow so little since 1950, we have a huge advantage over cities like Palmerston North that did grow, and even more so on cities like Tauranga, because we still actually have a great tram-built city layout. If you were to say bring back the bus routes onto the old tram network, you'd still get, I would say, probably a good 60-75% of the population. And extend them a little bit further and you might get a bit more of the population. But it is a question for us, and it's something that we need to think about as a city, because we could lose these great advantages that we have if we build more lines. What you want to do in public transport, you want to try to keep the same line, build more houses on one line, and you can make the bus more frequent and you can get more riders on it. But if you start creating another line here, another line here, every time that divides the frequency that you can actually provide on your service affordably. There's another concept in public transport, and that's that it's a really good idea to be on the way. So that's why when we've looked at a regional route, we've looked at incorporating Martin into our route between Wanganui and Palmerston North. Now this does add 10 minutes, but right now we're running a separate Martin Palmerston North service and a separate Wanganui Palmerston North service. Now if we were to combine those two, we could afford to run two services for the price of one. So even though you lose 10 minutes on the journey itself, what people don't often appreciate with public transport is that unlike a car, your travel time also includes waiting time. And we generally calculate your waiting time by saying it's half the average time between trips. So if you have the choice of running 2 services a day between Wanganui and Palmerston North and 2 services a day between Martin and Palmerston North, and then both being a little bit faster, or running 4 services a day between both and having them 10 minutes slower, by far your biggest time saving is going to be that you're going to have a smaller wait between services if both services are going through both. We'd love you to make submissions on this plan. It really makes a huge difference in terms of things you can do in your democracy that you will actually see a difference on. Whatever your view is, this consultation document will make a huge difference. It really comes down to not thousands, but hundreds or even tens of submissions as to whether we do things or we don't do things. And it's very easy to submit. You can do it online at haveyoursay. What is it? Have your say at Horizons. haveyoursay.horizons.govt.nz. You've got some multi-choice options and you've got the chance to do some comments. I'm encouraging people to choose the options they like, and it also helps if you write something short about why you'd like to see this and what difference it would make for you. What makes even more difference than just a plain submission is to tick the box to speak to it. This isn't for everybody, but if you are okay at speaking and you don't mind doing it, you jump on Zoom, you talk for 5 minutes. People who can say something positive about the way that they've been able to use public transport in the past, whether that's here or whether it's in another city that has good public transport, or people who can talk to something they will be able to do if the public transport was better, and perhaps something that they can't do now that they would like to because we have the level of public transport that we do. You don't have to answer every question. You can just answer the public transport questions if you would like. I would say it's well worth doing some research if you've got the time on the other questions. I would say that the preferred options for me are pretty good starting points. But if you have an issue where you're passionate about, for example, question 5 has 3 options for how much riparian fencing we do. So if you're passionate about planting and fencing waterways, you might want to choose a higher or a lower option depending on what you think. There's also an interesting question here at the back about our revenue policy. Really, this is actually asking whether we should try to find a way that if you have a lower value house, whether you should be rated less than someone who has lots of capital. So if you have an opinion on that, either way, you could give your opinions there. But on all questions, the preferred option are pretty good starting points. So one thing to note is that these plans take time. For the Wanganui City Public Transport, we're looking to try to start a new network by the 2025-2026 year. For our regional services, we were hoping to get that started about the same time. In the vote on the draft LTP earlier this year, we got moved back by 1 year. So the budget got moved so that we'd be starting these regional services to, say, Wellington by 2027. Now, if you'd like to see those sooner, that's something you can put in your consultation document. I'd certainly love to see them sooner, but the only thing that's longer than waiting till 2027 is waiting to the next long-term plan. I think what I didn't understand when I got into public transport is that your only chances to really plan new improvements for your public transport network are your 3-year long-term plans. So if we don't get things into this next long-term plan, we'll have another 3-year wait at least before we can put them in the plan. And then after that, you've got 2 years from the budget going into the delivery. So realistically, this is a once in 5-year opportunity to improve our public transport. Submissions close Monday the 22nd of April, and it really will make a difference to submit. So please consider doing so.